So I'm Nina Kelly from Reframing Race.
I'm Sanjiv Lingayah from Reframing Race, and today we're talking about definitions when we're talking about racism. So Nina, you're going to kick off. So why do definitions count when we're talking about racism and trying to change the conversation on racism?
Talking about language, talking about definitions, I'm going to kick off with quotes, obviously, from clever people. So first, there is Socrates. The beginning of wisdom is the defining of terms. And that's just that kind of self-evident thing, but which is worth saying, is that unless we're speaking the same language, we can't make the points and we can't bring people with us on a journey that we would like them to. So we need to be rightly understood. And often using the same words and speaking literally the same language doesn't mean that we're saying the same thing. And that's why we come back to defining the terms that we're trying to use. And then an odd favorite, bell hooks. Language is also a place of struggle. And that's intentional in a way. That's because it's a contested space in much the same way that our societies and concepts that we hold are contested. You know, they're constructs, aren't they? Constructed a lot of the time by people holding the power who don't have everyone's best interests at heart. So it's no surprise that language, in much the same way as some of the issues that we deal with, requires unpicking right from the beginning.
That's good. For me, I don't have Socrates or the great bell hooks, but I have like the image of fog. So I think what sometimes we say these words like racism or that's racism, and it ends up being a kind of fog that either washes over people or people just think it's just so in the air that we can't do anything about it. And so I think kind of for me, nailing some of this stuff down really helps. And I remember Nina, you and I were in a room in September 2019, Holloway Road. It was our first meeting with our advocates for Reframing Race. And we were all talking about racism, but I realized that we were all talking about it in rather different ways. And we had different ideas about who is impacted by racism. And so that prompted us to begin to think much more clearly about, well, what do we mean and how do we convey that and how do we bring people around some kind of shared understanding?
Yeah, so I mean, thinking about that room, because like you say, there were a lot of different ideas in there, and I think there were 40 plus people, different organizations, different backgrounds, lots of people thinking about racism. But like you say, we didn't have that shared understanding of what that word meant. Let's start there. So if we look at racism, we're also going to look at anti-racism and then Black and minoritized ethnic, or a selection of different words that we might use to call ourselves. So let's start with racism, because you did that work, I remember, after that meeting to bring about a bit of a consensus of, okay, here as Reframing Race, this is what we mean as racism, which I think got broad support. So tell us what that said.
Yeah, yeah. So I won't necessarily read out all the elements, but I think the big insight was racism is political. So it does work to lift up some groups in society, to downgrade others. And that's part of a kind of project of humanization and dehumanization so that that can determine who gets looked after, who gets punished and controlled. And I think that was quite helpful. So small p political. I think that was quite helpful because people could understand it as part of a process of yeah, who gets to experience the highs and who gets harmed in society. I thought that was quite helpful because that allowed people to come, people seem to come together around that idea. It's also helpful because although we focus on racism, obviously we're against misogyny, homophobia, class hatred, classism, and so on. And so that idea of this being about power, I think really helped to bring people around together around some kind of consensus and some kind of clarity.
And yeah, I mean, you need that piece first, don't you, before you even think about what anti-racism is, what the work that we do is. You know, we need to agree on what it is that we're kind of tackling. But to think for a minute about anti-racism and its definition, what that kind of means to me, I think of it as being an active thing, like a proactive thing, even like something you do rather than something you don't do. So it's not about not being racist. It's about, I mean, it kind of implies that, but it's really about recognizing that we all operate inside the context of racist structures. You know, there are underlying racist beliefs that are widely held and perpetuated. There are kind of mainstream of norms that censor whiteness and censor white people, um, and racially unequal outcomes that we see, you know, across the board, across almost every sort of measurement of quality of life, you could say. And so anti-racism is about recognizing that that's the environment, you know, at its kind of neutral space. And in order to do something about that, you know, you need to act. In order to work against it, or in order to not work with it, you need to be active. You need to analyze and you need to be conscious. You need to recognize racism at play, even where it's subtle or not kind of highlighted. And you need to work against it instead of allowing it. And I think about it almost like in the context of like my children, for example, and what I teach them or what I kind of try and do to their environment to redress the balance of kind of racist structures that exist in our society. And I was thinking, for example, if you were to do a sort of inventory of every depiction of a face that is in their world. So, you know, and I've actually thought about doing this, which just tells you how deep in this kind of game we are. I haven't actually, but I just imagine that you counted, you know, every sort of picture in a book or in a cartoon or on a birthday card, every doll or figurine that they have, every little Christmas decoration they see, you know, everything that has a kind of person-like face. And I promise you, overwhelmingly, the majority of those faces would be white. And that's my children, you know, who have got me daily trying to kind of redress what I see as this imbalance. And also decades of like, you know, expansion in diversity in various places. But nonetheless, they would see, you know, almost exclusively white faces if it wasn't for pushing back against that. So I suppose it's just that thing of if you don't do anything, then the status quo is here, you know, and it's an imbalance. So unless you're working the other way, then you're just allowing that imbalance to stick. To use yet another quote from yet another amazing person, like it does make me think actually of that Desmond Tutu thing, like if you're neutral in situations of injustice, then you've chosen the side of the oppressor. In much the same way, if you choose to do nothing, if you choose to be colorblind and just say racism is not a thing, then unfortunately you are choosing to perpetuate it. And anti-racism is about the opposite of that choice. It's about saying, no, consciously, I'm going to do better.
Yeah. Also reminds me of the Angela Davis quote, which I'll slightly mangle, but it's essentially in a racist world, it's not enough to be non-racist. And I think your point is a good one about if you go with the flow's racist. Um, so so people don't go with the flow. I sometimes do this exercise when I do facilitation. So you do this thing where you get people to fold their arms normally, and then you get them to fold their arms reverse, and it's actually quite hard, and it's actually quite weird because it's really not natural. And so baked into everyday ideas are who is human, who's fully human, who can represent the human experience, who can't. So it's really that being very intentional. And I think it's hard being anti-racist. It's heavy work because you know there are lots of situations where you can see how things are organized to elevate some people and downgrade others. So, you know, it's heavy work, and I know, with my children as well, kind of trying to do the dance between, pointing out things and getting them to think critically, even though they're 9 and 6. Um, but also, like not making them carry all the stuff that I have to carry. But yeah, that's part of the work, isn't it? Um, all right, there are other quotes. I think the shall I kick, I'm going to kick this one to you, Nina. So we have this challenge about, is there a helpful collective term for those people who experience harm due to kind of racism and racist ideology? And it's a thorny issue. It's a difficult issue. We settled in an imperfect way on the term black and minoritized ethnic. Um, Nina, do you want to say something about that, and then I'll have a go?
Yeah, I mean, we both of us have been involved in these conversations in various ways for like decades. Can I say decades? I think it probably is decades. Um, and it's kind of dynamic is one thing I would say. Like it's kind of ever changing. I feel like what we used at the Runnymede Trust in like the early 2010s, which was BME, but like black and minority ethnic, I think is what it was. And then there was BAME at the same time, black, Asian and minority ethnic, which was, they were almost a bit interchangeable. I know before that there was the capital B black, which was more encompassing other people of color as well. So I suppose I recognize that whatever we use today might not be what, racial justice advocates are going to be using in 10 years' time. And even there's global majority kind of coming in as well. I suppose what I would say, what I really want to say about it is that it's really useful to have a term that is a catch-all for all racialized groups. That is useful to have. So it's worth trying to figure out what you're going to use to say that. And it's important to be clear that you mean all racialized groups. So you're not just, for example, talking about people of color, because you might be talking about minorities that pass as white or are white, like Gypsy Roma travelers or Jewish people, but who experience racism. And so we want to be able to talk about all those groups together. And so when we say black and minoritized ethnic, definition wise, it's a pretty broad group. It's almost everyone apart from kind of white British or white European identities, but can include some of those people. So it's people who have been racialized, people who are affected by racism. But it's important, therefore, even more because it's such a broad term and an umbrella term that brings in lots of communities, to be specific when actually you're talking about a more specific category or more specific community. Like, so if you're talking about a specific community, then just say like Bangladeshi people or whatever. But even if you're talking about a kind of racism that affects a kind of smaller subcategory under that BME heading, try and be specific about that. I mean, I remember during the Black Lives Matter protests, there was talk about, police stopping BME people. And I remember thinking, this is the Black Lives Matter. Like, this is about Black people. What you mean is Black. BME is not a euphemism for Black. Black doesn't need a euphemism, furthermore. And I think there was almost a reticence with people to be specific about what they meant in that situation. They were trying to find kind of ways to broaden out that language. And I don't think that's the function of BME. But for all of that, I do think it's useful, especially given your definition at the top of racism and the ways it works and the fact that it's structural and it's political and it's about power and subjugation. We need a term that describes all the different groups of people who are affected by racism. And so it's useful to have, but clarity and precision are your friends.
Yeah, I think that's right. And echoing your point on be specific whenever you can be. So stop and search, that disproportionality against Black people. That's clear. You and I were at TEDx not so long ago. We heard the wonderful 5 times more women speak about Black maternal deaths and the specific issues there. So where we can be specific. I think the other thing that's one of the reasons why we do also use a generalized term is that in some ways racism is generalized, even though some of the impacts are very specific. And it's generalized to the extent it includes everyone, including white people, some white people who are helped by racism. So I think that's the other thing to think about. It's a kind of generalized foundational organizing principle of our society and lots of others. So yeah, that's it. I suppose maybe as we kind of move towards the end of this little piece, I would also very much echo what you said about speaking with precision. I think the clearer we are, the more specific we are, I think the more we stop these ideas becoming kind of wallpaper, like general fog. So, for example, on Black and minoritized ethnic, we never abbreviate it, BME, we always spell it out. And like we always spell the B with a capital, sorry, the black with a capital B, because black as an important construct of resistance as well. So yeah, be specific where you can. Absolutely. Any other final thoughts, Nina, on language and how we can help people to kind of just nail this reality of racism?
I think it's just important to say what you mean and explain what you mean as well, which is partly the motivation behind this piece that we're doing now, because there's so much kind of assumed or implied sometimes in some of these conversations that bringing things right back down to the building blocks and saying, this is what we mean when we say this. You can almost never do that too much, and it shouldn't be assumed, that actually we've moved past that. No, the defining of these terms can always be the start of that conversation. And I feel like, it's a good way in.
Okay. So what else should we say as we leave? Find us on reframingrace.org. You can find us on LinkedIn.
Yeah, we probably should say something, but it should just be like a sentence, like
Fine. Okay.
a really quick.
Okay. So we'll cut that last bit out.
So what do we think? So for more definitions, of course, we've got no. Do we want to point people to a particular page?
Well, it isn't currently on a particular page. You would have to go to contain strong language, but I think we should lift out the definitions
I
a
think
bit
we've
more on the
yeah.
website.
Let's just assume that's been done. So
Right, fine.
we've obviously only looked at 3 terms today, but for anyone listening who would like to know what our definitions are of many more terms, as well as our research into no, that's too much. So we've obviously only looked at
Why don't
3.
you just say for more
Okay.
on definitions? Da, da, da.
Yeah,
Anyway, sorry, I shouldn't
I
have
don't know,
cut you
I don't know, that
across
doesn't
you.
feel right somehow.
No,
I can't
okay,
remember what I was going
that's
to
all
say.
right. Pamela, no, Pamela's not going to cut this.
Keep
Oh
cutting.
my God.
Yeah, so we've only obviously looked at 3 definitions today, and you and I between us have looked at and thought about a lot more. So I would just direct anyone listening who wants more on this to reframingrace.org.